Okay, thank you and good morning, everybody. And thanks, of course, first of all, to Bart and Barbara, and therefore also to IARIW and to Statistics Netherlands for this very nice and kind invitation. It's a real honor. It really feels like coming home in many ways, seeing so many very familiar faces and good friends. I even have some family in the room, which is really hard for me because that's a very long time ago I had them in my audience. And it's also coming home, of course, being here in the Netherlands, which is a great feeling. I grew up in the east of the Netherlands in a small village. And Amsterdam was the place where the elite is living. And The Hague was the place where the bureaucrats and the government is sitting. And Rotterdam really was where the world begins in the Netherlands. That's where the seaport is and the town that has this aspiration to be a real global city. And it was here in 1965 that I went up the Euromast, which is a 101 meter tower here, and I went up there as a 5-year-old kid, and that probably was the high point in my life that I ever reached. So I really have to stand up to this today here in Rotterdam to see if I can get anywhere close to that. If you go there this week, just remember that now there's a big sort of space tower on top of it. Again, Rotterdam wants to grow, but this is really where it all starts for the Netherlands. This is a long history that I've had with IARIW. My first conference was in Rocca di Papa in 1987. I didn't make it quite back to 1957, Bert. But in 1987 I was there, and it's great to see some familiar faces who were there at that time. Of course, also a lot of new faces. But there were also some people there who've been very influential on what I've been doing since then and what my colleagues in Groningen have been doing since then. And they're not with us anymore. There was Hugo Krijnse-Lokker, who was working on purchasing power parities. There was Michael Ward. There was John Kendrick. And there was, of course, Derek Blades, who very recently passed away. And, of course, there was Angus Madison, who was my mentor and supervisor and has been very present in this association. And a couple of years ago, had the honor to give his keynote lecture. I think it was in Slovenia only a couple of years ago. So I really want to dedicate my talk this morning to them because they have been really very influential on a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today. And really, I do have to stand on big shoulders here because this is a vast topic that I was assigned to. And I always think for myself, how can I have agreed 9 months ago to this topic and say that I thought I could do this? And then when you get close to the date, you start to panic. So some thanks to my colleagues in Groningen, and particularly to my conference board colleague Abdul Erombam, who will be here later this week, who have been really helping me to try to manage this. But this is a very timely topic, a particularly good topic now, because we are 6 years beyond the emergence of the global financial economic crisis, and a lot has happened since then. Just think about it. We, of course, way past the immediate cleanup that the financial crisis gave us, the financial market mess, although we're certainly not done with that. We have gone through the hottest debates on sovereign debt. We have gone through a lot of challenges on recover growth, either through more stimulus or through austerity. We've seen many years of slow growth in the way that Reinert and Rogoff predicted it a couple of years ago. We have seen green shoots and false starts. We have seen double-dip recessions in Europe now. We have seen the debt ceiling debacle debate. You all remember it in the United States. And recently, of course, we have seen some issues around big depreciations and increasing inflation in emerging markets. And all of that is related to this global financial crisis that we are talking about here. So it is a big topic to talk about. And now, 6 years after the crisis, we are looking now at the possibility that all these things that are happening are coming down to one big theme that is now being very widely discussed, that this was not just a one recession out of many, that it wasn't even the Great Depression, that it wasn't even something like a lesser depression, as Krugman called it. There are many names that have been given about it. Now we're actually talking about something that's called secular stagnation, which Larry Summers has brought up a couple of years ago. And the idea that the impact of the crisis could be with us not just for 5 or 10 years, as Reinert and Rogoff predicted, but could be with us for many decades. Why I think to me it is clear that this is not a recession just out of many. I think it's a bit too early at the moment to call Armageddon and to think that we are in a secular stagnation, but it is a topic that's seriously discussed and something that I certainly will address later on this morning. But I like, of all these terms, to speak a little bit more neutrally about the issue of a, what I would call global financial and economic crisis. And the reason why I like that more sort of neutral term, rather than use the term of recession, is that I really think that we need to think about this from the perspective of a long-term comparative perspective. How did we get there? What brought us up to that recession? It just didn't come out of the year. And where are we heading in going forward in the next couple of years? And what I will do is that I will talk mostly about how do we get there. I will talk a little bit about where we are now, but frankly, I won't spend too much time on it. But I do want to talk a fair amount of time about, where are we heading? And I will use two important indicators that are important when we are looking at where we're heading. First of all, we have to look at investment. And that is investment in the broad sense of the word, because we really have seen investment in the narrow sense of the word slowing down very significantly in recent years. We need to broaden that concept to understand where investment is going, which is a key part in going forward. And we need to look at reforms. And again, we need to look at reforms in very broad terms. Reforms in domestic economic reforms, but also global economic reforms in order to bring the globalization pattern back to where it used to be. So it's a big topic to talk about, but let's just start and take a look at some of the numbers, just see how bad it was. This is just a 3-year average of GDP growth rates in the mature economies. I use that as a term to sort of identify the advanced economies. And you can see here how the developments have gone, and this was a bad recession. We had about 6 or 7 recessions in the mature economies since the Second World War. And you can see that the last one that we had actually gave us the slowest growth rate, basically on average a contraction of growth among all these mature economies. And even if we take a much longer time perspective, going back sort of through the whole industrial era, we can actually see that there was only one peacetime recession that was worse, and that was of course the 1930s. So we've learned some lessons in the past couple of years of what to do right and what to do wrong here. But clearly, even in a very historical perspective, this was a really bad recession. Now, we can also take a sort of more longer-term perspective, and instead of using 3-year averages, we're using smooth trends, and then you get a little bit of an idea about sort of where in the longer term we were heading with all this. And what I think is particularly striking in this chart, if you take this back all the way to 1820s, is to see how much actually growth has come down after this golden age that we had after World War II, basically from 1950 to 73. And then we had a growth rate that was actually pretty much above the average for the whole industrial area during the 1990s. But then since the 1990s, it has declined further and is now indeed at growth rates that are more similar to what we have been seeing at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's a lot has happened sort of in the past half decade in terms of the growth performance of the global economy. Now, of course, there's one big difference today that is not comparable to what has happened in the past. And that is that the emerging markets, at least what we call today the emerging markets and the development economies, of course, that has changed over time, but they have really come to the rescue. Because if you look at the red line here, you can see how important the growth in the emerging markets have been in the past decades or so, and that has, of course, made a huge difference to the overall global economic performance. If you take this backwards over time, the little red dotted lines that you can see there, you can see that in the past, what today's our emerging markets were performing considerably weaker than today's mature economies. Now, again, of course, today's emerging markets weren't history's emerging markets and so on, but of course it gives us some of an idea about how important the performance of the emerging markets has been for global growth. A lot of that, of course, is driven by China, and we have to take that into account. But if you look at the pink line here, you can see that even if you take out China, the emerging markets have been very important in terms of its overall growth performance. But at the same time, we've all been seeing that recently emerging markets have beginning to show a slowdown. I already mentioned earlier that we have seen the emerging markets also being impacted in a serious way by this crisis. Rapid depreciations that we have seen in the past 2 years or so, increases in inflation. But also some of these emerging markets, that's an important theme of what I will talk about this morning, are beginning to, emerging markets are also beginning to mature. And if you mature, you're getting closer to the frontier. And if you get closer to the frontier, you're just going to grow more slowly. So it looks like that very rapid emerging market growth that has come to the rescue of the slowdown in mature markets is probably past, and we have to get used to an environment of global growth that is significantly slower, which is what you see in this chart, where the blue line is now giving us the global growth performance. Again, of course, a trend basis. These are not annual numbers, but just on a trend basis. And then you can see that actually the world economy today, we're not in uncharted territory. We actually had a growth performance of the world economy comparable to what it was in the 1980s. except, of course, that at that time, the mature economies were growing faster. The emerging markets, were, of course, were growing considerably less at that time. But in that sense, we're not in uncharted territory. And even today, we are still growing faster than we were growing in the 19th century. So again, as I said earlier, this is not Armageddon where we are. We are seeing fast changes over the past 50 years, but in a historical perspective, we are still doing relatively well. And later on, when I will talk about where we're going to head, I will certainly come back to that theme. Now, I'm going to use my presentation this morning a little bit to sometimes put in a little bit promotion for things. So one piece of promotion I want to put in here is the Madison Project, because a lot of these historical numbers that I've been showing you are based on Madison's very important work. But since Angus passed away, and luckily we had a chance to discuss this with him when he was still with us, we actually continued his work in a large consortium of scholars, and we are reworking a lot of the data that he's been working on. And the first version of the Madison Project database has come out, and I've made some use of it. You can go to the Groningen website, and you'll find the new Madison Project database. So that's a little bit of advertisement. So here's what I'm going to talk about for the next sort of 35 minutes. And basically, it's kind of a course menu. We'll start with the starters, and the starters is really how did we get to this crisis. So I'm going to spend some time on, what are sort of the indications that the problems were emerging well before the recession actually hit us. Then I will take a little sort of short intermediate course, which is where are we now. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Frankly, that's what I spent most of my time on as chief economist at the conference board, which is why, for this presentation, I had to do a lot more work to work on the other courses. The main course is then where are we heading? Because I think that's, of course, the big question is how can we get our arms around where this economy is heading? Is this the secular stagnation scenario? Or are there much more optimistic scenarios thinkable? And what will be needed for that? And then as a dessert, and desserts are always very sweet, but this one may be a little bit very sweet, actually, is really what are the challenges for us as a measurement community? What do we need to do in order to help guide policy and decision makers about what needs to be done in order to revive growth and development in the global economy? So that's the recipe for the next sort of 30 minutes. So how did we get here? Well, let's just take a look at the global economy, and I'm going to show this type of chart a couple of times with different periodizations. The one you're looking at here is looking at the last period before the recession, 2003-07, and the period since the recession, 2010 to 2014. And you can indeed see how much the economy has been hit by this recession, and not just the mature economies which are at the top. There we see, of course, a significant slowdown compared to the pre-recession period, from about 3% growth to about 2% growth. But in fact, the emerging markets, in absolute terms, have been hit considerably more by this recession. Not just the recession, as I'll say, we've been heading into this. But before the recession, the emerging markets were growing at roughly, why are we missing this last two lines, I don't know, but we're growing at about 5-6% in the emerging markets, and that has also slowed down to about 4% in terms of growth performance. And you can see the global economy that was on average between 4 and 5% in the last few years before the recession has then slowed down to about 3 and 4% since the recession. So it's a big adjustment that we're making when we compare the last period before the recession and the period after the recession. Now, of course, the issues about what has been causing this crisis have been very extensively discussed, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the immediate causes. Of course, the financial market proliferation that was taking place, the great housing bubble, particularly in the United States, but not just in the United States. Several European countries have been facing this problem. And then, of course, the overtly austerity programs that many European countries had, or half-baked and sometimes, frankly, misdirected stimulus programs such as the United States has had. I mean, let's be very frank about this. There's a lot of talk about how great stimulus is going to be. But if you look at the United States and you think what stimulus has really done to rescue the US economy from this recession, it's, of course, most doubtful. So a lot of these causes have been discussed. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. What I want to spend time on is the more fundamental causes of it, and what that means for, the creation of what I call systematic risk. So the more fundamental causes that are often overlooked are basically a triple combination of three important factors. This is the globalization of markets, in particular capital markets, that vastly increased financial flows around the world. Secondly, the emergence of very rapid innovation around IT, which is great, but also the financial sector, of course, had all its great financial innovations. And of course, some of these financial innovations, not all of them, but some of these financial innovations got us in severe trouble where we're heading into this recession. And then thirdly, a sort of unbridled belief in deregulation. So if we think about sort of the late 90s and the early 2000s, these three forces, huge increases in globalization and capital markets, which we all thought was great, huge increases in IT and innovation, which we all thought was great, and deregulation, which most people, not all people, but most people thought was great. But if you put it all together, and you see where it ended up, then on reflection, I think we've come to the conclusion that this has provided what I would call a fertile breeding ground for systematic risk. And mind you, this is systematic risk, not systemic risk. Systemic risk is about the spillovers and the negative effects that you get in financial markets. Systematic risk has to do with the economic system and with the fact that all these three forces together have been affecting not just financial markets, but have been affecting the real economy and the aggregate economy in many, many different ways. And what we have seen as a result of all this is that we have seen a misdirection of investment towards less productive uses in financial markets, particularly, of course, helped by the very low capital cost and the low interest rates that we've had for a very long time. A very high risk exposure to the lack of what I would call regulatory safety nets. So, this belief in this huge deregulation led to the fact that, we basically lost the idea that we sometimes need safety nets in order to avoid bigger problems down the road. And thirdly, that we have seen an era of less productive investment, weak productivity growth, and less labor market mobility. And it is actually those three issues, those last three, the real economy side of the story, that I actually want to talk a little bit more about. Because when we look back, we now begin to see that well before 2008-09, we have seen these trends of less productive investment, weak productivity performance, and less labor market mobility emerging. So that's a very important theme for us to focus on. So again, a little promotion. What I'm going to do here in the next couple of slides is to look at this from a growth perspective and a bit of a growth accounting perspective, which is, of course, the tradition that I've been growing up in. So I'll be using that sort of growth accounting approach. We continue to do that work that was originated in Groningen. We continue to do that at the conference board. And this is our website from which all these numbers that I'm going to use in the next couple of slides are being derived. So let's look first at the mature economies, and let's look at the growth performance in three subperiods, 1991 to 2000, 2001 to 2007, and then the recession and post-recession period, 2008 to 2013. And basically what I've done there for the most important mature economies and their average is that I broke up the growth rates of GDP into the growth rates of the growth in employment, the growth in hours worked, if you like, and the growth rate of labor productivity. And what you're seeing here pretty systematically is that actually the productivity performance of mature economies already began to slow down in the 2000s. So the 1990s, remember, of course, was a period of a lot of investment, particularly a lot of investment in IT. We had the dot-com phase and the new economy. Then, of course, we got the dot-com collapse in 2001. But after that, we basically didn't see labor productivity recover to the same level as it was before. That's true for the United States, not quite true for Japan, it's true for the UK, it's certainly true for the EU, and for the mature economies as a whole. Now we can go a step deeper and take that labor productivity, that red part, and divide it into the various components, the sources of growth components, if you like. And then the blue parts here is the contribution of labor. That's then the volume of labor, hours growth contribution, but also the composition of labor, which is the changes in the skills of the labor force. The green parts in the bar here are the contributions of investment or capital, where the dark green bar is sort of the traditional investment in machinery and equipment. But the light green part is very important because that was the investment in IT, IT hardware and IT software as measured in the national accounts. And then, of course, the red part that is left, that's the residual, and that is what we call the famous total factor productivity residual. This is, the most famous residual that economists keep writing about and keep talking about, including myself. So it's still hard. Every time that I talk about total factor productivity, I always think, how can we spend so much time on a residual? Well, here we are. That's what total factor productivity is about. So if you take this all together, I think you're seeing here, first, two important trends. First of all is that light green part of the bar, which is the IT investment, actually began to slow down after 2003. I made that point before. We had the dot-com boom and then the dot-com collapse. And really the IT contribution didn't recover to what it was before that time. But also, and more importantly, the total factor productivity performance, the red part, began to slow down moderately in most of the economies, mature economies. Of course, once the recession hit, these total factor productivity numbers were all moving into the negative, except for the US. That is probably a temporary phenomenon, although it has been with us now for quite a while and is a matter of concern when we think about the long-term stagnation of the economy. Now let's then look at the emerging markets, and again I picked the most important emerging markets here, and the average of the emerging markets, so take China, India, Brazil, and Mexico. And of course that's a very different picture. There we have seen an acceleration of GDP growth after 2003, and a lot of that acceleration was actually driven by productivity growth, particularly in the case of China, labor productivity growth that is. Now, of course, this can get us into, and we have actually had conferences about China only, and we can have other conferences about it, and the numbers in China. IARIW is here in the room, and Harry has been writing a lot about these numbers and has been challenging these very high labor productivity numbers. And indeed, when you break the labor productivity numbers down again into the growth accounting contributions, you do see that in the case of China, there's been a very large growth in investment relative to the growth in total factor productivity, particularly in the most recent period. So there is an issue of sort of the balancing of investment versus total factor productivity, which is a real problem, and Harry has been arguing that, you know, these numbers, as well as we try to measure them, are still way overstating the importance of productivity growth, and that particularly in the most recent period since 2008, Harry's most recent work is actually showing that that red part, the total factor residual, is actually negative for China, rather than the moderate positive growth that we are seeing. But even if you take that into account, still we're seeing that overall emerging markets have been seeing this acceleration of growth. But there's another important observation to make here, and that is it's really a mixed bag of countries, emerging markets. And here are only the four most important of the many, many emerging markets we have. But if you look at Brazil and Mexico, and you compare that with China or even India, you see a very different picture. Much less acceleration of growth much more driven by investment, and very little, if at all, productivity growth. Total factor productivity growth in some of these economies has actually been negative for quite a while. Now that's a little bit of a concern, because you think, how can emerging market economies have negative total factor productivity growth for such a long time? Well, again, that's a whole story, but one thing to keep in mind is that many of these Latin American countries, and the same is true for sub-Saharan African countries, which I haven't split out here, are facing very large informal sectors in their economy. These informal sectors are extraordinarily labor-intensive, use relatively less capital. And if you add these two together, informal and formal, you get these composition issues that are creating some of these negative total factor productivity numbers. So we really need to have a much deeper look into these estimates in order to fully understand what is going on. But clearly what we're looking at here is that, you know, again, it's not just the mature economies that have been affected here. Also, these emerging markets have begun to see this sort of unbalanced growth between investment on the one hand and productivity on the other hand. So if you pull all this together, what you're seeing is these are just, again, long-term trend figures. This is just an HP filter that we threw over these data. And we look at the emerging markets and the mature economies and then the world as a whole. And you can see how gradually the mature economies, well before the recession, started to slow down in terms of the labor productivity growth, how the emerging markets started to accelerate, but really only temporarily, and then began to slow down as well. So I think what we're really looking at is that this extraordinary growth in these largest emerging markets was really the result of a catching up pattern that has been going on for about 10, 15, maybe 2, 3 decades, but gradually is beginning to wear off. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no other emerging markets that are still in the catching up mode. But we just think about it, you know, China, India, Brazil, and Mexico, they are some of the largest economies in the world. You need a lot of other emerging markets in order to make up for that slowdown that these economies are gradually beginning to show. Even India, there are some of our Indian friends in the room who have been working a lot on growth accounts in India. Of course, India still has a lot of potential for further growth, but gradually it will begin to slow down, and the speed by which productivity has been growing will begin to slow. But there's another number here that I find interesting to point your attention to, and that is what I call the standard deviation in the productivity performance between all these emerging markets. In total, there are 125 not emerging markets, but 125 economies in this database. And if you look at the standard deviation, which measures the distribution, you see that actually over time, gradually, the standard deviation has become down. So to some extent, countries have become closer in terms of their growth rates, not their levels necessarily, but in terms of growth rates. So the growth rates of productivity have gradually begun to converge between these various economies. And I think that is an interesting observation, because really what we're seeing now here is two trends. The first trend is we see a convergence of productivity growth rates between economies, but at the same time, the overall growth trend is slowing down. So again, think about this. We see a convergence in growth rates in productivity, but the overall trend is coming down. I don't think that's a particular happy combination in terms of growth performance. It's nice to see convergence of growth rates, but if it happens in an environment that is actually growing and seeing an overall slowdown pretty much across the board, I think it's a problematic kind of issue to go forward. Now, this is actually a nice moment to make a very brief segue into the issue of distribution. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not an expert really on distribution, but many of you in the room are here who are big experts in this. So I think I at least had to spend a little bit of time about this. It's a little bit, it's not one-on-one to make a transition from productivity growth rates to the distribution of income levels. But of course, you can imagine that if you see productivity growth rates gradually converge, you also will gradually begin to see income levels between countries to show some narrowing. So what you see here is a tail distribution of between and within country contributions, between and within country inequalities in terms of the levels of per capita income. This is work by Branko Milanovic, who's been doing great work around this for many, many years, and also been at many of our conferences here. And you can see that the blue part, which is really what I'm talking about here so far, that the blue part has indeed been narrowing. So we see the narrowing of productivity growth rates, and we see the narrowing of income levels between countries. But at the same time, we're beginning to see a gradual increase in terms of inequality within countries. Not a huge increase, but an increase that has been sufficient in order to keep ourselves very occupied about talking about what is going on there. So overall, still a moderate decline in global inequality. If you take everybody in the world together and you look at their performance, overall, we're actually becoming closer in terms of income levels. But the distribution has shifted from a larger, less of an impact on the between-country distribution to more impact on the within-country distribution. Now, of course, there are some good reasons for that. The most important reason, this is just sort of, showing you the cumulative distribution here, the density, and you see the per capita incomes of the various people in the world on the horizontal axis. And if you compare 1988 with 2008, you see that we basically moved from a bimodal distribution to a unimodal distribution. The bimodal distribution was, of course, the role of the distribution in the emerging markets, and then the second peak is the distribution of the middle classes in the mature markets. But because of the huge increase in incomes of middle classes, particularly in China and India and some emerging economies, we have seen that curve shifting out, and we're basically now ending up with this unimodal distribution. This is a very well-established fact, and for many in the room, there's nothing new here, but for those people who aren't working on this every day, I think it's a nice way to see how the income distribution has been changing from a bimodal distribution to a unimodal distribution. Also, what Branko has been showing is a very interesting chart that is looking not just at the distribution of the levels, but actually at the distribution of the growth rates. And there you can see two important trends. The first we already talked about, which is that first peak there is this rapid increase. This is the growth in wage income of the growth in wage income of the middle classes in places like India and China. That, of course, has been very, very fast. But the other important trend, and the trend that we're talking about a lot, is that at this sort of level of the 8th percentile in the global income distribution, you basically see an income growth, a wage income growth between 1988 and 2008 of about 0. So those are the middle classes in the mature economies that we're talking about that really haven't been seeing much of this income increase. Now, of course, a lot of the discussion is right at the 100 there, the huge increase in incomes of the richest people in the world, and that's where a lot of the popular debate is about. But frankly, from a growth, whatever you think about this and whatever opinions we have about it, from a growth perspective, I think the two important things to focus on is this very rapid increase in incomes of the middle classes in emerging markets, and basically the 0 increase of wage incomes in the middle classes in the mature economies. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what can be causing this. I don't have the time to go through this in great detail. Of course, recently we have had a lot of attention to issues of the wealth distribution. The work by Piketty, but also Saez and Sancheva have been very influential in the past couple of years. But I think from a growth perspective, it is really that sort of growth and decline or absence of wage income growth in emerging and mature economies that is really the thing to focus on. From a growth perspective, the performance of these very large middle classes are the dominant forces of inequality across economies. Now, the reasons for this have been very extensively discussed. Actually, when you go to the Jackson Hole discussions, the papers of last weekend in Jackson Hole, a lot of discussion was about labor markets. There were some great papers there. Some papers by, for example, Autor and Goossens, which of course is all about this issue that we have these distributions in the skill range, and that the middle distribution in the skill range, which are the middle classes that I've just been talking about, have been most hardly hit by the technology and the outsourcing trends in the economy. So we have seen a lot of replacement and substitution of the skills of the middle level range of occupations impacting those groups. We have seen that in the United States, very well documented for the US, but increasingly also in the work by Goossens, being very well documented for other mature economies. And potentially, this also is an issue for emerging markets, because we're thinking that this outsourcing will continue to increase these kind of jobs, move these jobs out from mature economies to emerging markets. But frankly, the technology itself will increasingly also begin to impact emerging markets and challenge emerging markets whether they can actually create enough jobs in this middle segment of the occupational distribution. The other thing that's very important, and another paper at the Jackson Hole conference last week, go to the website of Jackson Hole and you find them, is the work by Davis and Haltibanger, which are using these micro labor market data. And they are now documenting so clearly that we have seen a very significant decline in the reallocation of workers and jobs. So it's hiring as well as entry and exit, hiring and layoffs as well as entries and exits. That we have seen that actually emerging for a significant period of time, that basically since the 1990s, both job mobility and worker mobility has significantly declined. So we see less people moving from one job to another, and they're making a very strong claim that that is one of the forces that will be negative for growth, because worker mobility and job mobility and reallocations are of course helping economic growth. So there's just some pieces of evidence. Again, I wish I had more time for this, but I obviously don't. But I think the main point to be made here when we look at these inequality numbers is that it's very hard to see that we can continue to create a more equal society without sustained economic growth, however imperfectly we're measuring this. And that is a very unlikely scenario for moving forward in the longer term. So that's the brief segue that I'm making on the inequality discussion. I'm sure that later on, and I just see Paul Snabel walking into the room, and I'm sure that so the train actually made it, luckily. And that means that I don't have to speak for 2 hours, but only for 1 hour. So that's of great help. But I'm sure that later on this morning we'll talk about the inequality issues in a lot more detail. So just recap for a minute on where we are before I go into the next section of the talk. We have seen a significant slowdown in GDP in mature economies. A lot of that due to less investment in IT and a slowdown in total factor productivity. We have seen that emerging markets have not been unaffected by this. They have been driven by an unbalanced growth in investment relative to total factor productivity. We actually have seen a convergence of productivity growth rates between countries, but overall productivity is growing much more slowly than it used to. We're seeing an increase in within income inequality because the returns of technology and investment are paying off unevenly across different skill categories. And we're seeing less mobility of the labor force, which is causing a downward pressure on wages and on productivity, and therefore potentially a negative impact on growth going forward. And then finally, the emergence of this crisis basically reflects the fact that we've seen an excessive financialization, a lot of our resources in the economy growing to the financial sector of the economy, and a dwindling of opportunities for productive investment. So that's what led up to this crisis. This crisis just didn't come out of the air. It was something that was gradually building up in the period ahead of time. Okay, so where are we now? I have to speed up a little bit now. And as I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on where we are now, but just a few numbers here. These are just the very recent growth rates that we're seeing in the most important mature economies, the US, the euro area. US is red, euro area is blue, Japan is green. And you see a lot of volatility there. Some quarters are great, some quarters are terrible. Even in the United States, the first quarter of 2014, we saw a contraction in the economy. Then we saw a rapid recovery. Japan is even more volatile. Europe is really slow. That's basically the story here. Underlying that GDP numbers are some important trends. One is consumption. Again, these are the consumption, the household consumption, private consumption expenditure trends as the level. So these are indexes. You basically see that only the US has been able to actually get well ahead of its consumption level it had before the recession. But the other economies are struggling. And in case of Europe, we haven't even recovered the level of consumption in the economy compared to what we had before the crisis. And investment, again, I made this point earlier, investment is very important. And here we see the big changes. None of the mature economies has recovered anywhere near the investment levels in the traditional way that we're measuring investment compared to what it had before the crisis. Not the US, not Europe, not Japan, not the UK. We're all looking at investment levels today significantly lower than they were before the recession. This is a topic that I will want to come back to. A few more words about the labor market. I already mentioned the labor market earlier. Of course, we're beginning to see, luckily, a little bit of a slowdown, a little bit of a decline in unemployment rates, even in the case of Europe, the blue lines here, which are relatively high. In the US, it has been going on for a while. In Japan, it has been significantly lower. So that's all a good development, but mind you, it's slow, particularly in the case of Europe. But also I want you to look at the lines. The lines are looking at the workforce, the labor force participation rates of 15 workers in 15 years and older as percentage of the total population. And you see that in the US, where labor force participation typically has been much higher than in Europe and Japan, that labor force participation rate is gradually coming down. And this is an interesting development, and one of the reasons that Jackson Hole this past week was spending so much time on labor markets, because we're in this environment where on the one hand we're seeing this decline in unemployment rates, but on the other hand we also see a decline in workforce participation. And again, that's not a very happy development. A lot of economies are still seeing slack in the labor market. This is a way of measuring the actual unemployment rates relative to the natural unemployment rates, the equilibrium unemployment rates, if you like. You see that most economies still have slack in the labor markets if there are more than zero, just only Germany and Japan, Estonia, a few countries, Canada, who are now actually already at or below their natural unemployment rates. But still a lot of challenges for many countries. And it will be quite a while for some economies to get back to their natural unemployment rates or to reach their natural unemployment rates. Some countries are already there, including Germany and Canada. The UK will be there this year or next year. So quite a few countries, Australia, Denmark, Sweden, it will be 2016, 17. But some countries, including the Netherlands, for example, where unemployment is relatively low, it will still be until about 2018 before we think we'll come back to the natural unemployment rate of the Dutch economy. So again, this recession has been with us for quite a while and we're not through this yet. And then, as I mentioned a little earlier already, this decline in workforce population, of the working age population in 15 to 64 is a major concern, and we see that in most of the mature economies, we see that slowdown in the working age population taking place. We have been seeing that taking place over the past 2 decades. So just to wind up this section very quickly, what we're looking at the moment, if you look at the blue bars here, again, you have the mature economies at the top here. You have the emerging economies in the middle. This is just the blue bars is looking 2014. The red bars are looking at 2013. And you see we're still looking at the global economy of about a 3% growth rate. We were hoping a little bit more this year, but then, with slowdowns and disappointing performance in many mature economies, we're still ending up at about 3%. And as I said, that's not terrible. We have been here before in the 1980s. But obviously it's much weaker than what we have been used to in the last 2 decades before the recession was hitting us. Okay, so let's now spend some time on where we're heading. And this is an important part of the story because that's of course where we know least in terms of how things are going to look like in the future. So what we're doing at the conference board is that we're trying to make projections of long-term economic growth where we use the growth accounting model that I've just been describing to you, but then we're projecting it forward, using some forecasting techniques in order to project forward the growth of the labor force, the blue parts, the growth of capital, which are the green parts, and then the labor and the total effective productivity, both of which, total effective productivity and the capital contributions, which are estimated econometrically. So what you're seeing here is pretty much overall for mature economies and emerging. I pulled them all together here. There are 55 countries in this projection methodology. We're seeing a significant slowdown taking place relative to what we've been seeing in the years before the recession. That's true for the mature economies. A lot of that being driven by the weakening in the contribution of demographics to economic growth, but also a significant slowdown in terms of the total factor productivity, the red part. You see that slowing down in mature economies, but also in the emerging economies on the right-hand side, you begin to see that slow down. So you see investment still relatively important, but productivity beginning to drop off quite significantly. We're still working on improving these models. I have to admit, I'm still concerned about that the investment contribution in these projections looks a little large compared to the total factor productivity contributions. But the recent work that we have been doing on this and that we'll be publishing soon is that it is very hard to get away from this slowdown in economic growth in going forward, partly because the demographics are not only impacting mature economies, but also beginning to impact the emerging markets. They still have large demographic dividends now, but in the future this will become much more difficult. And partly because the productivity performance, as these economies get closer to the frontier, it's just harder to continue to increase productivity at the same rate as what they were doing during the catch-up phase that I've been describing earlier on. So here is a translation of that in the similar type of chart that I showed you earlier, but now we're just looking at the projections, 2014 to 19 and 2020 to 25, and the bottom line is, you know, mature economies, they will sort of recover to about 2.5% growth. That's what they have been doing. They're not going to grow much faster than that, but they will get back there. It's not spectacular, and certainly you have the slowing demographics. It's not going to add a lot. But the big game changer for the global economic outlook is the slowdown in the emerging markets. And we can discuss how fast this is going to go. We can discuss, you know, will this happen in the 2014-19 framework, or will it perhaps happen that slowdown in 2020 to 25? We can argue about maybe there are other emerging economies that are making up for the slowdown in China and India. But overall, I think it's very hard in these projections to get away from the picture that in the next decade or so, the global economy will continue to slow down, and it will slow down to something between 2.5% and 3% rather than 3% and more. Again, not disastrous, but a very different environment than the 2 or 3 decades that we have been seeing before the recession. Okay, so once we're there, what are these base scenarios basically telling us? And, is there any way to think about how we can gradually move away from, is there a way to move away from these negative base scenarios? And what we've been doing here is that we've been actually trying to work at the conference board on different ways to identify some future scenarios on how the economy can possibly develop. And the 2 important drivers that we think are going to make a difference on how the world will look like in the next 10 years or so have to do with investments and reforms. So on the vertical axis here, you see investment. Again, I mentioned this issue of a significant slowdown in investment that we have been seeing in the past decades or so, and certainly since the recession. Also, a lot of that investment is sort of the traditional investment as we are measuring it in national accounts, but there's a lot more investment. We need to think much more broadly about investment, and I'll talk a little bit about it if time allows on the importance of intangible investment, for example. And on the horizontal axis, you're looking at the reforms. And this is reforms in a very broad sense of the word. These are economic reforms in labor markets and product markets and capital markets, but also global economic reforms that have to do with our global trading system, with our global financial system, with the way that we're dealing with global environmental issues and CO2 emissions and climate issues and so on and so forth. Those, in our view, are the 2 important drivers. What is going to happen to investment in the broad sense of the word, and what is going to happen to the reform environment that we are looking at. So these are sort of the 4 scenarios that we've been focusing up, and really, if you look at this, what I've done here is that I thought, being in one of the flattest countries in the world, maybe a nice way to think about scenarios is to put it a little bit in levels of elevation. So I'm talking about a flat world. That flat world, of course, is a concept that you've heard before. Tom Friedman has been writing about this idea, a sort of somewhat idealized world, I think, where we have no borders anymore, where we have free flows of labor and capital and everything. And a world that really gives us this very good growth performance that we began to believe in before we were hitting this recession. Bart earlier mentioned, never waste a good crisis. Well, maybe this is the time to see if we can reach that somewhat idealized world that I think Tom Friedman was describing at the time. Then, of course, there are other scenarios here. I'll go to them in a little bit more detail. The mountainous world on the left-hand side, that to some extent is the world where we were before we were hitting the growth acceleration of the 1990s, before the IT boom. This was a world in which some countries were doing very well, some countries were doing much weaker. And to some extent, you could say that's a world where some people say that's really the normal that we're talking about. We've been talking a lot about the new normal, but maybe the new normal that we're looking at is the old normal, which is the normal that we've been seeing before 1995. So that's the mountainous world. Some other people are saying, well, we've moved from that mountainous world to a race to the bottom because we have had all this globalization in the 2000s, but really what it has done, it has led to a huge amount of competition and a cut in cost and in prices and in wages around the world that has created some of these issues in inequality that I've been talking about before. And if this globalization of the world economy cannot be stopped, we will continue this race to the bottom. And then, of course, on the left bottom side, there is the secular stagnation scenario that has been so much discussed in recent times. So let's quickly spend a little bit of time on each of those four scenarios, and then I'm going to make a few remarks about implications for measurement, and then I'll wind up. So let's start on the secular stagnation scenario, because that is the scenario that has now, as I mentioned earlier, been so extensively discussed. Larry Summers introduced this concept about a year ago. It's an old concept. He recoined the concept in a way. But then, since then, many people have been picking up on it. And just again, a little bit of promotion, not for any work I've been involved with myself, but Fox EU has been doing a great piece that's just out, I think came out last week, on secular stagnation. You can find it on the web. It's contributions by Larry Summers, by Paul Krugman, by Barry Eigengreen, all great thinkers around these issues of secular stagnation. But also contributions by people like Bob Gordon, for example, who didn't really coin this term, but, oh, what's happening here? Is this meaning, that probably means that I'm running out of time, but I hope that we are going to get the lights back because I got a few more minutes from the organization. Oh, thank God. I thought this was a way of fading myself out. Anyway, there are two ways to look at the secular stagnation hypothesis. One is the demand side, which is really what Summers and Krugman have been talking about, particularly Summers. So this is really the idea that you have an output gap. You have the capacity at which the economy can produce output, and we have a current output level that is much lower than that, and that this output gap is not closing, and that if we don't do something, we will not be effectively able to ever close that output gap. So he's basically saying the current macroeconomic tools that we're having will make it harder and harder to achieve full employment, to have productivity at potential, and so on and so forth. It's a demand-side approach. We need to do something to stimulate the economy to close that gap between actual and potential output. Gordon is the other side of the story. That's the supply side story. And Gordon is basically saying, yes, there's an output gap, but actually that output gap isn't nearly as large as you guys think, because yes, the actual output level is low, but the potential output level is actually coming down. And therefore the gap is much smaller. And why is the potential output level coming down? Well, because we have negative demographics, which I identified earlier. We have educational problems. We have inequality issues, which I identified earlier. We have debt issues. And all these things make it that the output gap is much smaller. And mind you guys, you are ending up in a difficult environment where you're going to face inflationary pressures much earlier than you think. Because if the output gap is going to go away, we'll get inflationary pressures much earlier than you think. Whereas Summers and Krugman would say we have a deflationary environment that we really need to worry about. So there are really very different schools and large disagreements in this, but what they do all agree on is that there is a combination here of low real or even negative real interest rates, low inflation, weak potential output growth, and that are the key ingredients for a very long-term slowdown, a slowdown of several decades of much slower growth in the global economy. And that gives you that environment that you see there in the bottom of slow global growth, weak competitive pressures, deflationary pressures, at least for the time being. Gordon would argue that, we'll move back to inflation before you know, but still we're in a deflationary environment right now. Unfulfilled promises to middle classes, huge issues with distribution of income between countries, but even more so within countries. Well, here's just, let me not spend too much time on it, but here's just some illustration of this issue of potential output growth. On the left-hand side, you see the green line was the original potential output growth as predicted by the Congressional Budget Office in the US. and the purple line is the actual revised potential output growth. So even the Congressional Budget Office in the United States is already making this point that potential output is significantly lower and the growth rate is significantly lower than what we have been seeing before. And similar trends are recording in the case of Europe. Now, the two other scenarios to focus on, first of all, is that mountainous scenario. That scenario is sort of going back to the pre-1990 period, to the 1970s and 1980s, if you like. And I call this a little bit a light version of the Gordon thesis, because really when you look at the 1980s, that was a little bit what Gordon is describing now, but it was just the beginning. In a sense, Gordon is arguing that his way that he's looking at the world now really started at the end of the 1970s. So that was sort of the first time that we're seeing this. And some of that kind of thinking you can see reflected in Reinert and Rogoff. I mean, they're not saying that we're going to secular stagnation. They're just saying it takes a long time before you'll begin to recover. Vernalt has been writing about the issues that US productivity growth, that's very slow right now, but if you really compare it, it looks very much like what it was before 1995, before the IT era. And maybe what we're getting into is an area that's much more like the 1970s and 80s than it is like the 90s and 2000s. And then the Central Planning Bureau, the Netherlands Policy Institute, that have been just putting out a piece that basically is arguing, no, we're not in this environment of secular stagnation. Growth potential is still there. It just takes a long time. So the argument of all these people who sort of in favor of this idea of a mountainous world is that we're going back to an old normal, the 1970s, 80s performance, which again wasn't a disaster, but is significantly slower growth than what we have been used to in the past, in the 2 decades before the recession. The other one, the race to the bottom, is of course the whole idea that, very rapid declines in unit labor costs that we're seeing now as a result of wage cuts and cost savings that are happening everywhere around the world, that is driving a lot of competitiveness rather than productivity growth. We would like to think of competitiveness in terms of innovation and productivity, but a lot of competitiveness may just occur because we're cutting on costs and cutting on wages. And indeed, when you look at some of the great work that's been doing on the fragmentation of global value chains, a lot of that sort of fragmentation of global value chains, a lot of it is presented here in the meeting, is also sort of based on this idea of companies seeking cost advantages and have really brought that search for cost advantages to a level of perfection that is making these global value chains work so effectively. But whether it is necessarily the best way to drive growth for the global economy in the longer term, I think remains a big question mark. Well, let me then end with the scenario that we all would love to see, and that is the flat world. And as I said earlier, I think the flat world idea that Tom Friedman has been promoting before the recession is a little bit of an idealized world, a world in which we indeed are seeing a lot more in terms of a lot more in terms of globalization of the global economy, a free flow of resources, and as a result, we see the resources being used in the most productive places in the world, and that will, of course, drive productivity growth. Now, how can we possibly get there? And again, there are many different schools here. First of all, very vocal is what I call the technology pundits. And of course, Brynjolfsson and McAfee has been most vocal, but there have been other people talking about this story. Look, there is just so much technology and innovation out there. Just wait and see, but it is going to change the world in a massive way. And, of course, there's a downside to it, and that I mentioned that downside earlier, that a lot of this IT is substituting for labor and for jobs, but still in the longer term it will make us better off in terms of living standards. IT is a general purpose technology, there are a lot of adjacent technologies and life sciences, and they will all help us to tackle some of the fundamental issues that we're dealing with today in terms of environment and health issues and healthcare sector issues and so on. What we have to realize is that that may all be true, but this can only happen if we are going to invest in the economy. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not investing in the economy right now, and we are certainly not investing in those parts of the economy that are most conducive in order to translate these technology developments into faster growth. Let me quickly go there, but my colleague at the conference board, Carol Corrado, is doing a lot of work on measuring intangibles. Intangibles are now also becoming part of the national account terminology. But in national accounts, we just now moved to including software and databases. We're now including R&D in our national accounts, and it's a big issue in terms of implementing this. But Corrado and also Holton and Sickle, with whom Carol has been doing this work, are saying we need to think much more broadly about intangibles. This is not just about computerized information, not just about R&D, but it's much more broadly about design and other new product developments. A lot of it is informal R&D, not really measured R&D. And very important, there's a category that we're really not picking up in national accounts at all, which we call economic competencies. Issues related to market research and branding, issues related to organizational capital and business process investments and improvements. And we need to begin to pick those parts of investment up to really understand what is going on. Now, why is this so important? Well, when you try to measure this at a macroeconomic level, you're beginning to see how important intangible investments are becoming as part of the economy. So look at this left-hand chart, which Carol and some others, including myself, have been working on. But in the United States, for example, 12% of GDP is already made up of investment in intangibles, which is more than the level of tangible investment in GDP. And also in other countries it's less, but it is increasing very significantly. And if you look at the right-hand chart, where we just look at the United States, the red line is showing you that already by the mid-1990s, intangible investment in this broad sense of the word was more important as a percentage of GDP than tangible investment. So go back to my investment statement. Investment in our traditional way that we're measuring it is slowing down. But is it really, if we're thinking about the intangible part of it? And maybe it's that intangible part of it that we need to measure in order to understand what is going on in the future. That is why it is so important, that we need to think about today's economy and the investment trends in today's economy are very different from the traditional way in which we measured it. And I'll come back to that in my final remarks. The other school that is very important when it comes to the thinking about the flat world is, of course, that we need an environment where we get away from this idea of deregulation and a government withdrawal, but we need a much more activist government in order to make this happen. And an activist government means that we need to regulate markets better in order to improve safety nets for economic and financial disaster, that we need to have a lot more fiscal activism, including wealth taxation, including investments in infrastructure, and also, very importantly, access to fundamentals in the economy like education and healthcare. That we need to have interventions in order to deal with environmental issues, whether it is regulation or carbon taxes or cap and trade. And we see some of these trends currently in the economy. We see much more discussion now about the possibility of more government intervention than we have been used to, and that certainly has been the ideology in the past 2 decades before the recession was hitting us. Doesn't mean that everybody agrees with this. You know, coming from the United States, there's a large chunk of people who think this is the worst thing, that this is real Armageddon that we're getting into. But the reality is that I think the debate is gradually moving much more in that direction. And then on the right-hand side, there is the return of global coordination. And that is that, we need to begin to think much harder about how to deal with new style trade agreements that take into account things like intellectual property rights and global value chain issues that I mentioned before. New styles of governments, of sovereign finance and development aid, agreements on environmental safety, and protection, and also new style agreements on international migration. All big issues that we're dealing with today, and where we're making very little progress in terms of international coordination. So this is sort of the ideal scenario. And you can see when you look at those these three sort of ways to get at this is really a tough scenario. And even though we all would love to go there, it is not sort of the most obvious way to think about where we're going in terms of going forward. Finally, and then I'll wind up on this part, there is, of course, another school here that I haven't mentioned at all, and that is the school of the system thinkers. We've been talking a lot about active intervention and things that we need to do in order to get to a better world. But there are people who are thinking, this is just, you have to realize that what's going on right now is part of a longer history of systematic changes that are taking place in the economy. So this work is in the tradition of people like Schumpeter and Kondratiev, has been later pushed forward, of course, particularly by Chris Freeman at Spru, who also passed away in 2010. And more recently, in the light of the current global recession, Carlota Pires, who is now at London School of Economics, has been sort of pushing this sort of thinking that maybe we just have to think not too narrowly about what we need to do now, but that this is part of a longer-term development of systematic changes that are taking place in the economy. And maybe there's just some good news here. Maybe the good news is that where we were actually right now, or where we're getting out from, is sort of the Kondratiev winter, if you would call it like that. We're seeing this era of falling price inflation taking place, that we've been seeing this sort of frenzy period just before the recession that I've been talking about, where we were chasing these financial returns. and that maybe we're now gradually going to an environment in which technology will become to get deployed in the way that, to some extent, Bryn Jolson and McAfee have been talking about, and that maybe we're gradually entering a much more positive world than the world that we are describing in the secular stagnation scenario. There's no time to go into this. I would recommend Carlota Perez's work, which I think is fantastic. You need to have another sort of mind to think about these issues, but I think it is a good way to think from a really long-term perspective and do justice to the work that sort of influential thinkers like Kondratyev and Schumpeter have been emerging. So let's recap and then wind up. Again, if history is the only good predictor of the future, then frankly, I do think that long-term stagnation is a real possibility. The base scenario is predicting, as I mentioned earlier, a significant slowdown of growth to less than 3%. There's a between income inequality that has declined, but we cannot really deal with an environment in which we are not able to tackle the within country inequality. But frankly, I think history is not the only way to give us the signpost towards the future. And we need to think much more creatively about some of these scenarios that I've been describing. It's just the beginning of thinking about that there are multiple diversion paths possible, but the more positive scenarios do require significant changes in the way that we think about investment, that we actually measure it and move it forward, and reforms of markets and institutions. So, finally, what does this all mean for what we are doing here at the IARIW, whether we are measuring national accounts or whether we are measuring aspects of global growth and development? Well, again, I could spend a whole talk on that, and I'll want to save a lot of that for the panel discussion later on. There are some great papers here that are dealing with some of the ongoing improvements that we are making within the current national accounts boundaries as they have been defined by the SNA. Some of the terms, FISM, STIC, that was already mentioned, the role of multinationals and head offices and holding companies in the process of globalization. It's all really important to deal with these issues, and I think it is great that national accounts are trying to really tackle these issues head on. It's also good that we have seen developments in terms of thinking about how can we more actively anticipate and monitor financial crises and recessions more in general. IMF and the G20 and the Financial Stability Board have been making contributions to this. But I also want to emphasize that we really need to continue to think about more analytical extensions of the GDP framework. And there are two things that I really want to emphasize. One is the importance of spillover effects. Whether there are positive spillover effects as they arise, for example, from technological change and innovation, or negative spillover effects as they arise from some of the environmental and climate challenges that we're dealing with. It's very hard from a national accounts perspective to see how we're going to handle that in the national accounts framework, but spillovers are there, and we need to really think hard about how we can tackle them, even if we don't have the right and easy numbers to observe. Also, very importantly, we need to measure consumer surplus in a much better way. We're dealing with all these free goods and services that are people talking about. How are we going to measure those in the light of an environment that remains a resource-scarce economy? And of course, there's all the work, and I'm not going to talk about that because I'm sure that Paul Snabel will actually talk a little bit about that, or quite a bit about it after the break, about going beyond GDP. And again, these are very important developments. Also, this is my final advertisement. I have nothing to do with it, but I do think it's a great initiative that IARIW is now thinking about a specific conference that is thinking about the system of national accounts, not just within the boundaries of the national accounts, but also where do the national accounts need to go in the longer term. I have my own wish list. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's a very biased wish list of things that I think are important. Integrated growth accounts, the importance of intangible investments. I already mentioned that. I didn't talk about the spatial integration of the national accounts, which is very important to think about globalization. Of course, we need to do a lot more in terms of being able to measure new products and services, including those free digital products. And all these things are very important. Oh no, there was one other piece of advertisement. There's a very nice book by Diane Coyle, who's a very good writer. And this is the first book for many times, a somewhat popular book about GDP. So can you imagine to write a book and just call it GDP? I mean, even national accountants wouldn't do that, but she did it. And I actually read it. It's actually a great book. I think it's somewhat provocative. It's very well written. You can just download it from the internet. I won't make advertisements from who you can download, but it's one of the very big online publishers, so that's where you can get it. And I think it's really worthwhile for any national accountant to take a look at it. You won't see anything new, but you will see something from an economist that is not part of our crowd, but who does know what she's talking about. And some of it is controversial, some of it now may not be quite right. I talked to Nick Alton last night, who's done a review of Diane's book, and he has some issues with it, but I would recommend you take a look at it. But I really want to use one of her ways of thinking about national accounts as something on which I really want to finish, because she gives a great history of national accounts. And again, what it made clear to me is that really most of the progress in national accounting historically has been made in times of crisis. Most of the progress in national accounts was made when we had to think about paying for World War II. I'm not saying we should think about that again, but when we move further, also we made a lot of progress when we were beginning to think about Keynesian stimulus policies. That's when the national accounts really made huge progress compared to what we have been doing since then. And really what I think the current crisis does is that it really creates a real need and an urgency for a very drastic action on national accounting. So here are some of the things that I think are perhaps controversial and an issue for discussion. But I do think that national accountants and national accounting is being taken hostage by administrative purposes. And that we need to really think about using national accounting to think about growth and development rather than about administrative kind of issues. We need to actively support research on those issues. Many national accountants and national statistical offices need to cut on budgets, but there are very creative ways by which you can get more research, of which IARIW, of course, is one of them. You can develop shadow accounts of unofficial statistics. I've been myself involved in growth accounting and been pushing statistical offices to put out growth accounts even as an unofficial statistic. It was really hard for many statistical offices to think about the possibility that you can have statistics that are not official. Well, maybe you have to think about these kind of things. And you have to integrate a lot more modeling approaches in national accounting. Overall, don't steer clear from controversy. If you read back in Diane's book, and you read about the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a huge amount of controversy about what national accounts had to measure. And it was not just about numbers. It was about real, serious political, economic issues that we had to deal with. So we cannot steer clear from controversy. We cannot steer clear from a certain lack of perfection. Rome wasn't built in one day. And probably we need to think big, but we can act small by making some real serious steps forward. So this is all up for discussion, and I'm sure that people have different opinions about this. So finally, repression, depression, secular decline. I do think we are at a time that things need to be really different. This is the worst economic and financial crisis since World War II. Again, it's not unprecedented. We had been here before, but we need to avoid, and we need to do everything to avoid to get down a path where we certainly don't want to go, which is an unavoidable, that some people think, an unavoidable stagnation of the economy. History helps us to understand things, but it cannot provide us the only signposts. We need to look at the performance of emerging markets. We need to focus on the importance of investment. We need to think harder about integrating production, socio-economic, and financial accounts in our statistics. And we need to rebalance the need for administrative and analytical uses of the national accounts, which will be a crucial way to revive the role of all the work that you are doing and discussing in this meeting in order to contribute to a revival of economic growth and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. This really is a very big issue, the global economy, its past, its future, and a lot of interesting challenges for statistical offices. I'm sure it would not have been a problem if you were asked to talk for 2 hours, because you did a really good job for this comprehensive overview. Thank you. I'm sure there are a lot of questions and remarks. We're not going to take them now. We're going to have a coffee break. There will be a panel discussion later on. Peter van der Ven will lead that. Paul Snabel arrived, so the train was in time in the end. So I'll see you back at 11 o'clock for the continuation of this session. Thank you.